Hello, NORTH02. Welcome to the show.
Nice to meet you. How you
Yes,
doing?
a bit tired. My voice is a little bit low as well. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself first?
Yeah, this is what I feared the most for this podcast. So, I'm a YouTuber. I've been making content for around 10 years on a bunch of different videos, but as I got a little older, I narrowed it down to science in general, science communication. If you follow my channel for a long time, I was more into paleontology for a while, but I just became much more fascinated in humans, ancient humans, archaeology in general. I actually am going to get my bachelor's degree in marketing this next fall semester, and then I'll be going back to school for archaeology. So I haven't actually started archaeology school, though I've done some classes. And that's mainly because my university didn't even actually have a program for that. So I just had to finish out my bachelor's in marketing before I could even pivot to a degree in archaeology. So yeah, I make archaeology content, long form documentaries mainly on YouTube.
You also have a podcast, right?
I put the audio onto Spotify. So, I mean, it's basically a podcast with visuals.
With me is opposite. I do everything for podcast and I upload on YouTube just these pictures of somebody who is on our dialogues or series of pictures if I'm talking about specific art, and that's it. I'm more for the Spotify and podcast for the audio for people to listen in the car or when they're working or whatever they're doing. YouTube is only for the videos, and I don't have time or energy to make these huge videos and every 15 seconds to change the frame. No,
Yeah,
no.
it's hard.
What are some of the most significant examples of Paleolithic art in Europe that you are fascinated by?
I'm fascinated by, honestly, basically all of it, but the cave paintings and the engravings and portable art objects are just, I've basically cataloged every single one of them at this point. I'm so fascinated by every little minute detail of these little figurines they made, why they could have made them, and just the quality of the art is really astounding. These people were not just doodling on cave walls. Like, it appears that they must have practiced for hours, or maybe they painted on pelts or on bark or something like that. But it's really amazing the artistic traditions that they developed over such a long period of time, too.
Have you ever had the chance to read a book or to listen Genevieve von Petzninger?
No, I have not. I listened to her podcast on here, I believe, right? It was pretty recent. And I found it
Yeah.
super interesting.
Well, she's a very, very fascinating lady. And she has a YouTube as well. She goes with a small camera and she films her archaeological digs.
Uh-huh.
It's a short YouTube video, maybe 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and she explains what she's doing in the field.
I'll have to check her out.
So you want to be archaeologist, right?
I think my position will be more as a filmmaker, really. I think I need to get the skills and the education to be able to communicate better in archaeology. I do want to go to field school and go on some archaeological digs and work with archaeologists closely, but I don't plan to be publishing papers or really working at like higher levels, I guess.
I have a different set of questions to ask you then.
Oh, okay.
Because I thought that you are leaning towards anthropology and paleontology. By listening your podcast and watching your really long videos about Solutrean culture, for example. By the way, great video.
Thank you.
Have you seen the film called The Cave of Forgotten Dreams?
I have seen the trailer. I have not seen the whole documentary, unfortunately.
You should watch the whole film. It's done by Werner Herzog.
Yeah? It's on Chauvet Cave, right?
Yeah.
Another thing I need to watch.
You wanted to talk about violence in Paleolithic.
Violence is just one of those topics that is pretty unavoidable when talking about humans. It's just something that we will eventually do, put two people in a room, and eventually violence might spring up, unfortunately. But in terms of just understanding cultures, I mean, you can learn so much just talking about conflict, interpersonal violence, violence at larger scales. Take, for example, the Aztecs. I'm sure you may have heard of like the Flower Wars. It's kind of ceremonial wars that they'd have for captives, and it's just fascinating. Or wars in Papua New Guinea. There's amazing photos from, I forget the guy's name. I think it's Rockefeller's grandson or something, that he was in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. The pictures of their wars were just, you need to look it up. It's insane. So violence has been a part of cultures since the dawn of our species. I mean, really, on a small scale, violence is just inevitable. But the real question when we get to the Upper Paleolithic is, how frequently did it occur? And was it organized, or was it more of a rare thing? Researchers typically think that warfare didn't really appear until around Neolithic times when populations were higher and there was more conflict. But we do have some direct evidence of at least smaller scale conflict or violence during the Upper Paleolithic in art and a few remains. But I don't want to say that violence was very common, and I don't want to say that it didn't happen at all. There's always people on both sides of that argument that are arguing incessantly in my comment sections. And obviously, it was not one or the other. It would happen once in a while, probably not that frequently, but it still is something that was important enough for them to write down in their art on their cave walls and some pretty, I'd say, gruesome examples. I have a few examples from specific caves of these people full of spears. I mean, you could interpret this in a number of ways. Maybe it's not a literal depiction of violence. It seems to be what it looks like.
There was no violence on a huge scale, maybe one-on-one or small group of people, but never huge tribes or anything like that.
Yeah, I didn't mean to cut you off, but at this point in the Paleolithic, like the population is too small to really, for like a war or a battle or anything like that. It would probably be more just less than a dozen individuals or something like that.
Yeah, we don't know how they lived. That's why I have these art stories that I'm writing all the time, totally imagining the world they're living in. So we don't know. But do you have any theories about it?
Well, I've read, I couldn't tell you what paper or author it was, but they were talking about how, basically back in the Paleolithic, your neighbors, I mean, you relied upon your neighbors in order to survive. If you had a bad week maybe and you didn't get an animal and you were starving, or a bad month even, it was your neighbors that you went to get some food, some shelter, some warmth, to recoup and to go out there and look for some more food, hunting or gathering, whatever it may have been. So yeah, generally in the Upper Paleolithic, it was pretty peaceful and people relied on their neighbors a lot.
How do you imagining how they live their lives?
I mean, that's a good question. I think it's always good to look at recent indigenous societies or hunter-gatherer groups. And we're talking about the Upper Paleolithic. One of the best things to look at would probably be people living in Siberia or like Upper Asia, North Asia, or the Inuit, for example, because they were usually living in like similar population densities. But overall, yeah, I think their nomadic hunter-gatherer life, I like to think it's a lot more cheerful than you often see depicted in the art. Often looks gloomy. People are just trudging through life. But I mean, when you see videos of people living this traditional lifestyle, there's a lot of laughing. I mean, you're bored, you're walking around. All you can do is talk to your family and friends, people that you've known for your whole life. I don't think it was nearly as gloomy as a lot of maybe the art or even some stories make it out to be.
Yeah, you're probably right. I mean, people are people. Technology and culture change, but we are essentially the same for the past few 100,000 years, or at least 75,000 years when we left Africa.
Yeah, I'd say cognitively, I'd say that's completely right.
Are you only interested in Paleolithic of Europe or in general in the East Asia or Middle East, India, North Africa?
I'm interested in everything from Homo habilis to Bronze Age. I think my interest kind of stops at around Bronze Age. I wanted to cover the Upper Paleolithic with this large series just because I really couldn't find that much on it, at least on YouTube or just in popular sources. But I think I'm going to move back to North America, and I'm working on a large documentary about the Old Copper Complex. I don't know if you've heard of it. They were Native Americans living in the Great Lakes region who have worked copper for probably over 10,000 years. I really want to show that to more people, and I want to cover other Native American societies and ancient hunter-gatherer cultures as well.
I never encounter anybody who's doing art history from the beginning, so I was saying, okay, let me do it then. Because I was studying history of art for 8 years in total.
Yeah.
And plus, I still love reading about it.
I mean, I more or less still cover anthropology, archaeology. So both of the topics, I'd say, is what I'm interested in and cover. But as in formal education, I am going more towards the archaeology route.
How anthropologists study the social structures and practices of different societies?
I think art is definitely, got to be one of the best avenues to study about their daily life. It tells you about what they believe in, what they hold dear to them, and just them expressing themselves symbolically. As in the Upper Paleolithic, I'd say you can learn a lot about their view of the world based on what they depicted in their art, such as animals. For the first 30,000 years, animals were the only things that they really painted. Sometimes there'd be a little simplistic human figure, but usually it's animals. And people have hypothesized many things about, or many ways, why do they depict large animals instead of, and a lot of these animals, they didn't even necessarily hunt, but it seems that these animals were part of their mythology, part of their worldview. They looked up to these animals. They had a spiritual significance, and their daily life was dominated by looking at these animals, going out on the landscape to find them. Some of them they hunted, and others they might have been afraid of, such as big, scary cave lions or even mammoths, which are obviously very dangerous as well.
Are you familiar with a statue called the Lion Man?
Yes.
If it wasn't of religious significance, what if it was a toy?
That is definitely one of the ideas around it. Again, we've seen from the Inuit that they actually spent a lot of time carving seemingly pointless little objects for kids to play with. They spent hours and hours carving hard materials like ivory or bone just to make a little toy for their child. So that is not out of the realm of possibilities at all.
There was also small statues of Vogelherd figurines.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
I have reproductions in my office right here.
I wrote a story about how actually it was toys for the kids to play. Do you want to talk about significance of colors in cave paintings? What do you think about that?
I hypothesize that they probably did have some pretty symbolic meanings to them. Maybe they were painted naturalistically, but the color didn't necessarily match their body. A lot of times they painted with red ochre, and red ochre is an iron-rich red pigment. You know, a lot of animals aren't red. I mean, sometimes shades of brown, but in like the cave of Altamira, for example, the bison were spray painted. They had a little bone tube and they sprayed out red pigment to create the paintings there. They were choosing that pigment for some reason beyond just its utilitarian function as paint. Red ochre actually has a lot of uses there's a lot of cultures that still use it for things such as mosquito repellent and more nuanced things. I mean, one of the reasons is because it resembles blood, and it might have been seen as a life force or something that they were spreading on the paintings. I'm not really sure, though. I haven't studied too much into the pigments, but I know red ochre was definitely one with a lot of symbolism and was important to these cultures for sure.
Red is often linked to life and vitality, but what about black?
I mean, a lot of times charcoal would be used to sketch out the painting before the rest of the color was added, but they also obviously used black paint as well. I mean, I could only guess about the symbolism around black paint. They used a greenish color pretty often as well. I forget the name of it, though.
Calcite?
I don't
Yes.
remember.
I always imagined that people colored their own clothes as well. And I always imagined somebody would take black, especially teenagers.
Well, I think you made a great point about clothing being covered and some other things in the daily life, these people being covered in paint. Again, when we look towards other Aboriginal societies or Indigenous societies, Australian Aborigines in particular, not often every day, but definitely for very symbolic reasons. They would paint elaborate things on themselves, on bark, on all these things. I mean, it was very important to them. So when I imagine the Upper Paleolithic per se, I think that a lot of their clothes would have been covered in a lot of patterns, and maybe their faces would have been painted. We know a lot of their objects were painted, especially when they're buried. A lot of their burials contain a lot of red ochre poured over. Have you ever heard of the Red Lady of Paviland? It's actually the remains of a male, but the bones were stained red because of red ochre was placed all over the grave.
I know, I covered in one of the episodes. Yeah, because I'm going chronologically. I would like you to talk about Solutrean culture because you made such a good video about it.
Thank you. Well, the Solutrean culture was a time in Europe when it was in Western Europe, in the modern countries of Spain, Portugal, and mostly southern France during the last glacial maximum, so an incredibly cold period. This was the coldest time that modern humans had been in Europe for, and the glaciers expanded to their furthest extent in 125,000 years, roughly. So these people were pushed out of their basically ancestral homelands into refuges where they could survive, such as Cantabria, southern France, parts of Iberia, but even the inland of Iberia was just uninhabitable, so they were mostly limited to the coast. And in their regression, they actually developed a lot culturally. For one example, the famous Solutrean points, or the laurel leaf points. They really developed their flint knapping. And if any flint knappers listening to this, I'm sure that you're aware that flint knapping is an art. I don't think you can really separate flint knapping tools from their art culture either, because if you've ever flint knapped a point, you understand just how beautiful it is to send flakes off of it. And if you've ever seen a Solutrean point, you know that these people were really masters of their craft in terms of flint knapping. The hypothesis is that when these people had to retreat to these refugium during the last glacial maximum, it really concentrated a lot of people and they were stuck together, and they just decided that they had to live out through the hardest part of the ice age. And that meant a lot of time indoors. And I think that's why they developed a lot of new culture and their flint knapping techniques as well.
One of the first guests on this podcast was a guy named Thomas Frisera. He's Italian and he is experimental archaeologist, and he does flint knapping all the time. He wants to hunt real animals in the mountains.
Very interesting.
Speaking of these leaves,
The laurel leaf points?
yeah, when you see these flint points, spearheads basically, when you see the spears and how they look, these leaves are much wider, and I don't think they were used for hunting.
Solutrean points, they're found all over northern Spain and Iberia and southern France. I mean, some of them seem to have more of a utilitarian purpose. They were a little bit thicker. They would have done a fine job at the end of a spear. And some of them were better for butchering animals, such as knives. But yeah, when we talk about the Volgu cache, that's a specific area where they discovered a bunch of, I believe it's over 16, I forget the exact number. And these points were definitely not used to hunt or to butcher an animal or anything else. These points were very wide and very thin. If you look up pictures of them, it's pretty unbelievable. And think of it. So flint is basically, it's more or less glass. I mean, it's a little bit tougher than glass, but it breaks just like it. And you wouldn't want to stab an animal with a point that is as thin as a Volgu biface. And another thing to note about them is that they were found deposited upside down in the ground. Whoever made them was an absolute master of flint knapping. Modern knappers can hardly even replicate how good this knapper or couple of knappers were. And then they proceeded to place them downward into the ground, and that's how we ended up finding them thousands of years later. We were very confused on why this knapper decided to deposit them in this way, and they were never used as tools. One of them shows a little bit of light use, but nothing really substantial. So it is definitely a mystery and very interesting that they decided to make seemingly ceremonial tools.
I have a hypothesis that these were maybe ritualistic, maybe to mark a spot where maybe a hunter would stand and hunt. Just my hypothesis or my poetic thinking. Somebody would come there, put the spear in the ground to mark the spot when he or she will stand and hunt.
Well, I don't really have any specific hypotheses in particular, but I mean, it does just seem to be a display of pure skill of flint knapping. I mean, flint knapping is a very difficult art. I mean, I call it an art. And the Volgu napper was clearly showing off how good he or his friends were at producing these bifaces. And if we look even across the Solutrean world, we see a similar thing. They almost seem to have been competitive about how beautiful they could make these points. And it's not just about making them thin, and definitely not about just making them functional. They were trying to make these points as beautiful as they could. Typically, it has to do with the flake scars that you leave on the biface. So when you take a flake off, it leaves basically a hollow area, a little divot in the point that makes it thinner. And the Solutrean nappers were able to set these flakes up off of each other. So it makes almost like a ripple across the blade almost. That's what we see when we see some Solutrean bifaces.
Yeah, and beautiful colors as well. They're not just black or gray.
That's another great point. The raw material they use to make these points. During the Solutrean times, trade networks were up to 300 kilometers sometimes, I think even further in some cases, just to get the flint to where the nappers lived or where they were operating out of. So they really went out of their way to get the most stunning material.
I saw this one. It almost looked like a rainbow.
Was this a Solutrean point?
I will send you right away.
It sounds like rainbow obsidian, but...
What is rainbow obsidian?
It's a pretty rare obsidian variety, and I don't think it would have occurred in Europe. It basically has different chemicals trapped in it that make it so it literally looks like a rainbow when you look through it, because obsidian's clear. So it has these different chemicals or particles, elements suspended in it. So when light hits it, it literally looks like a rainbow. It has all of the colors. I own a few pieces of it, and it is honestly mind-blowing. There's also a point to be made about the development of Solutrean technology, or you could even say Solutrean art in their flint knapping, because we know from their sites that it took at least 1,500 years for them to develop the technical skill to be able to make the points they're making during the Middle Solutrean, I believe. It's really just shocking because they started making off these pretty maybe primitive kind of points. I mean, I don't like to use the word primitive, but they were unifacial, and they gradually made their way up to just extremely fine points.
I found it. Portuguese Solutrean.
Brings up another point I have to say about Solutrean. So have you ever heard of heat treating stone tools?
No.
Stone, if you ever find it, flint, chert, all these varieties that are considered knappable, you can only work them into tools because they conchoidally fracture, it's just the way that they break, which allows you to shape them much easier than, say, something that's coarse grained. A lot of stones just don't nap how you want them to. A way that you can get lower quality stones to actually fracture like quality flint or even sometimes even like obsidian is by heat treating them, often in a campfire. So you expose them to not too much heat, but just enough heat to turn the insides a lot smoother, and it allows you to send flakes much better. The Solutreans are actually the first archaeological culture to use heat treating on fine-grained stone. So there were some other cultures in Africa, actually 164,000 years ago, I believe, that heat treated coarse-grained stone. They were the first to heat treat fine-grained stone, and this really allowed them to make some great points. The Volgu points were not actually heat treated. They did a paper on that and found out that wasn't the case. Another thing about heat treating that I think is really relevant to this podcast is it actually changes the color of the stone often. A dull-looking gray stone after the heat treating process can turn out to be red or green or a mixture of all these different colors. It's almost like when you fire a pot, like ceramics, you fire something with glaze on and it goes in looking dull, but it comes out with all of these colors. So it's very interesting that the heat treating process was developed during the Solutrean and just so happens to have, some artistic connotations to it, I'd say.
What I want to do is tell people stories about art, show them that we always did art. Do you know about Hominin?
Yeah, of course.
Do you want to discuss Hominin with me? Do you think they made art?
Not really my place to say, I guess, because I know it's a very controversial thing about them making art or burying their dead. I made a large project on them back in the day before all of that came out, so I missed researching pretty deeply into it. But I've kept up to date a little bit about the discussion around Homo naledi, the possibility that they may have buried their dead or created art. I believe there was kind of scratch marks within the cave that appear to have been art that they may have made. But I really couldn't say if that is art or that was just them scratching the walls or if it was even a natural feature.
At least it was a symbol. But I do think there was something there, some kind of a map of the cave or something.
The worst thing that we could do is underestimate their capabilities. We know that other hominins besides ourselves made art. It's fairly well established at this point that Neanderthals made cave paintings and even treated other things very symbolically. We think that they buried their dead. We're pretty positive that they did. It depends on every site, but they also did a lot of other strange things that you might not usually attribute to Neanderthals because they were a different hominin. We found eagle talons with cut marks around their bases, which seems like they were making a necklace. And I think they might have even perforated some teeth or shells or something that could have also been worn as jewelry. And if you go even further back, there's a shell that I think it was discovered in Southeast Asia, and they think it was made by a Homo erectus. It has geometric designs on it. It's pretty simple, and it's pretty small and maybe even kind of nonchalant, but it's great evidence that even earlier hominins were making art. So I definitely think it's something that Homo naledi could have been capable of. I wouldn't say that without more evidence, though. I understand that researchers have problems with some papers that have been put forward. I definitely just think it is in their capability. They would have to prove that they did indeed make this art or bury their dead, which is, I think, even more difficult to prove.
Do you know about Sulawesi cave?
Yeah.
They're just pushing it back in time, further and further and further. I wouldn't be surprised if, and that's in Indonesia, there's a lot of miles or kilometers from Indonesia to Africa. So there must have been places, caves, that we didn't find, or they are underwater or destroyed. They must have done art from that period, from Africa to Sulawesi Island.
Have you heard of Blombo's cave?
Yeah, I made a whole episode about it. When you're speaking on the phone and you have a pen and you just scribble, doodle, doodle, doodle. What if somebody was being bored and did some patterns and maybe they didn't call it art or they didn't have a conception of art?
I think that's a really good point, is that it wasn't that one day they picked up a rock and were like, now I will create art. It was just a gradual process of symbolism, I guess. I guess it's kind of hard to put into words, but I think over time, yeah, it went away from just utilitarian, just survival. And I mean, they were human. Some researchers consider every hominid after maybe Homo habilis or definitely Homo erectus, which you would call hominins. A lot of them would consider them human, at least Homo erectus onward. A lot of people consider Homo erectus to be the first human. And this is a lot because of their lifestyle. I mean, they pretty much lived a lifestyle very similar to Neanderthals or ancient Homo sapiens. So who are we to say that they didn't have symbolic thoughts going through their heads? I mean, they were humans after all, and they're the ancestors of our species in the case of Homo erectus. I mean, if you go back further enough. We don't really know when the symbolic spark started, but I don't think it was some line in the sand that one day, they decided, okay, now we're going to start being more creative because our brains are bigger or something like that. I think it's something that has been there for thousands of years. I'm sure you can even find examples of animals doing creative or artistic things. I know a lot of birds hold displays for their mates. I would have to remember the species name of the bird, but they make whole displays for their mate out of flowers and other things to attract them. And I mean, how can we say that that's not symbolic or say that that's not art? Ancient humans were definitely capable of art and probably made a lot more than we'll ever find in the archaeological record, whether it have been with paint, wood, or other materials that have now decayed.
Are you familiar with Japanese pufferfish that makes patterns in the sand?
I don't know if I am. I mean, you know much more about the definition of art or how to classify or consider art than I would say I do. So what are your thoughts about that?
It's definitely something. There's a lot of fishes who don't do this. For those who are listening, it's a symmetrical pattern, almost like arabesque in the mosque.
Yeah.
It's in the brain. If you take seagulls and they have the red beak, researchers show that if you put a stick with the two red lines on it, the babies, chicklets, when they're hungry, they tap on the mother's beak. But researchers took a stick and painted double red, and they went bananas. So there is something in the brain. If seagulls would start making art, they would make huge paintings of yellows and red and call it Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel and admire it. So there is something in the brain.
That brings up another interesting point. I mean, it's just think about the appreciation of art across just different cultures and societies. Some Aboriginal Australians made a lot of paintings on bark. And I mean, I could see how someone from Renaissance Italy would see this and think of, oh, that's crude, there's no artistry to it. But to the Australian Aboriginals, that little piece of bark with those geometric or whatever designs are on them means the world to them. I mean, that's their entire culture and it's very sacred to them. I mean, you could say the same things with animals just because we might not understand the significance of, say, this pufferfish's circle that he made. I mean, to him, I guess it means a lot to his mate too.
It's a male who makes it to attract female. Same with the dance of birds that you mentioned. So there is something in the brain that tells them this is how you do it. Some kind of a consciousness that we don't understand.
Yeah, and who are we to say that our ideas of art are any more significant than birds or even the pufferfish? They really do have concepts like that, or it could all be the same thing, basically. Same calling.
Do you know about the Stone Ape theory?
Yes, I've heard of it. I mean, the problem I have with the idea is how would you even really test that psychedelics had a role in the development of the symbolic mind? I don't know if there's a way to really empirically test that. I'm sure someone has thought of it. I really haven't read into the stoned ape theory that much, but I think there is definitely a role of psychedelics within ancient human societies. Obviously, there's documented cases of it throughout the world. Hunter-gatherers had an immense knowledge of basically every single plant and animal in their world, and they definitely would have known about the psychedelic ones. I'm sure they would have figured that out eventually. I think it definitely played a role, but it's hard to measure it. There's some cave art from Algeria, Tassil, I don't know how to pronounce it, but there's actually a figure that is, I think, called the mushroom shaman, a shamanistic-looking figure who's covered in mushroom designs. That highly suggests that maybe these people were using psychedelic mushrooms with their rituals, which Psychedelic mushrooms have been used in historic times. And if we go to the Amazon, ayahuasca, that's another important psychedelic drug that has been used for spiritual reasons for who knows how long. That could have been used since people have been there. Maybe over 20,000 years people have lived in the Amazon. I definitely think that psychedelic drugs had to do with the development of symbolic mind, maybe a little bit, but proving it or figuring it out, I don't know where that theory could go.
I know that you are very fond of languages. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I hated learning Spanish in high school. I mean, everybody has to learn a language in high school, at least here. And I was just a kid and I was just annoyed with the homework and I didn't really have a passion for it. But as I've grown old, I've found it so fascinating to learn other languages, especially learning about what it even means to speak an Indo-European language and, how all these languages in this area are similar. When I consider like Paleolithic time, it's even more interesting to think because those languages are all dead. There may or may not be a little bit of influence on modern languages, but the languages spoken in Upper Paleolithic Europe, especially the earlier ones, they're completely gone. Maybe some of the pre-Indo-European languages have some kind of relation to Magdalenian, but it's really fascinating to think about how they would have communicated. I imagine that there might have been a lot more sign language. They might have even used clicks like in Khoisan languages. The possibilities are really endless. I mean, it's interesting to think about how language shapes the way you think, quite literally. So I just imagine the possible language of some of these ancient people and even early humans and how it shaped the way that they interpreted the world around them. I mean, that's kind of the most basic question, but I can't pretend that I'm not fascinated by it.
Let's talk about colors. Most of the languages didn't have word for the color blue. When you think about it, the sky is blue, the sea is blue. It's very fascinating that there was no blue color in ancient Greece. They called it bronze.
Huh.
Yeah.
I'm aware of it a little bit. Indo-Europeans been able to trace linguistically, like they didn't have a lot of words for a lot of things because originally, they were confined to the steppes. So there wasn't nearly as many words for the ocean or waves or all these other things. So they had to come up with a lot of new words once they got to other parts of Europe and Asia.
Imagine living in Paleolithic Europe and you're living in the cave. All of your words, all of your culture is based on stories that people told one another. We will never know the specific words, what they would see when they would see red color. When you say red on English, or rod on Swedish, or cerveno on Bosnian, such a strong pronunciation. But when you say blue and plavo and blå, you get this very soft word.
Yeah.
I do wonder how they perceived color and how their culture was shaped by the words and stories they told to one another.
I see what you mean. Just thinking about red ochre. I mean, they covered a lot of graves and a lot of their tools were covered in it. It's a bright red color. At least for maybe English or the Western world, a lot of times red is maybe a scarier color or it's used to show aggression or war, or the connotations behind it are not always positive. But I can see how in maybe the Aurignacian world or just anywhere in the Upper Paleolithic, red was much more positive color. I get what you're saying about linguistically. It would have been just a whole another set of connotation for their language.
What if the red was forbidden word to say?
I think you're bringing up a very important point about bringing up taboo, because taboo is a very important concept or idea for a lot of ancient societies, modern societies, and definitely ancient cultures, though. I mean, there's this Australian filmmaker that some of you may have heard of named Malcolm Douglas, and he made documentaries with Aboriginals mainly back in the day, like 60s and 70s. And unfortunately, a lot of these traditions have died. He got to film a lot of these rituals and just daily life and culture up close, very intimately with these people. I was surprised by is just how structured and taboo hunter-gatherer life can be. It's not just a bunch of people running around, you kill this, you eat it with your buddies, you go to bed. Their daily lives were structured by a lot of taboos and especially their rituals. There's one episode of one of his documentaries of Australian Aboriginal life where a young boy is circumcised. Just the ritual that they go through to perform this ceremony is complex in every definition. The women aren't allowed to even see or hear the boy scream during the ceremony. His family sits on him and he's painted elaborately before the ceremony to ensure the good spirits. I don't know the specifics, but it's so complex, some of these ceremonies and the taboos that surround them. And like I said, again, in daily life too, there's taboos around how you cook your kangaroo, how you hunt the fish, what to do with the remains. Taboo just dominates the lives of hunter-gatherers. And this is something that, again, we must consider when we think about maybe the Upper Paleolithic or anywhere really in antiquity or prehistory.
Hunter-gatherer societies now in Africa will never praise good hunter if he, because men going to hunt. If he is good at it, nobody will praise him because that will mean that he will be arrogant. And arrogance leads to wanting power and leadership.
Just imagine how that came about. It's pretty easy to, I guess, understand. Maybe their cultural understanding came about just practicality. You don't want an arrogant hunter taking all the applause. Maybe he's going to become arrogant and then he won't be such a good hunter anymore.
They know the story about baboons, very dominant group of alpha baboons. These alpha males ate the poisonous food and they all died. Who stayed behind? These baboons who were not dominant, when they took over, they became very, very egalitarian. Even the new baboons that came to the tribe, they would teach them how to be egalitarian, not dominant.
I have heard of that story, actually, yeah. Well, I think you brought up like interesting points about power dynamics in some of these ancient societies. You mentioned a baboon example, but I mean, it applies to some human societies as well. They don't really think that there was egalitarian, which is, I mean, more or less what they think about, at least Upper Paleolithic societies, is that there wasn't really one leader, or there was probably elders. They were probably the ones that made a lot of the decisions, again, because of their wisdom, but it wasn't like there was some ruler. Maybe this does change in the Upper Paleolithic a little bit because we start to see burials that are very elaborate, that contain thousands of beads, and beads would have been very valuable at the time. So maybe that does start to change. I remember I wrote in my video on the Aurignacian culture, it was about the sexual division of power. The power dynamic often depends on how much food they provide to the group. That may make you think that, oh, then men must have had all the power because they were hunting all the big animals and bringing all the food. But as it turns out, in a lot of societies and a lot of places, the men actually don't always contribute the most food to the families because the women are out usually getting storage organs, like underground storage organs or fruits and other vegetables that actually contribute more to the caloric intake of the tribe or family than whatever animals the men get out of the forest. And women also do hunt as well. They definitely hunted in the Paleolithic. Neanderthal females definitely hunted. So it's an interesting power dynamic between male and females that we shouldn't just think of, caveman. He's going to tell the cave woman what to do because he's big and strong. Human societies are very complex and don't always agree with the stereotypes that we have formed about them.
A few episodes back, I made an episode about 3 statues of men from Paleolithic and around 200 female figurines.
Yes.
So that tells you something. There was a huge reverence for the female. Why is there so many YouTubers and ridiculous theories?
I definitely do have something to say about, I guess, the popularity of pseudoscience or pseudo-archaeological content on the internet. It's just kind of a product of the times we're living in, to where you can watch a 60-second video telling you about how the pyramids were actually used for this or that giant human bones were found in a grave here. This newspaper says it. It's a lot more catchy content than me making a little reel about Neanderthal tools or what Neanderthals were doing or Solutrean points. It's going to win in the popularity contest, unfortunately. I've heard this recently, is that people don't actually like to learn. They like to understand. Learning is hard. Understanding is easy. They want to hear the guy with the charismatic voice tell you about pseudo-archaeological content. I mean, it's really a problem, I think, with science communication, too. I think as that's what I would consider myself, a science communicator. At the end of the day, the viewer is going to choose what's more entertaining, regardless if it's pseudo-archaeology or regular archaeology. And that has to do with every field of science. I don't know if it's so much to blame on the education systems. I think all schools could benefit on making better science communication at earlier ages, so this gets into their system. It's pretty much left to science communicators to try to communicate these messages as best as possible. It can be a losing battle because there's a lot of very charismatic pseudoscientists on the internet. That's just how it's going to be, I think.
these specific people that I've listened on several podcasts and so many YouTube channels, their approach is scientific. The premise is based on fairy tales.
Yeah.
The last three questions. What is art?
Ooh. I'd say art is something that you. Now, this is a good question. Now I have to rethink it.
Nobody ever gave me two same answers.
Right. Art, I think, I'd say it's the extension of the symbolic mind. It is something within your mind or spirit or soul, however you want to put it. To me, it just feels like it's something that wants to get out of your mind and enter reality. Sometimes when I'm making something, whether it be an artifact, flint knapping, or casting metal or something, I can't stop thinking about this thing in my mind and what it's going to look like after I make it, how I'm going to make it. I think it's just an extension of something inside of your soul or spirit that is longing to get out. I hope this does not sound corny or anything like that, but that would probably be my answer to the question.
My late grandfather said to me when I was a kid about different opinions from different people. He told me there's a 5 fingers on each hand and they are all having different functions, but they all work together. When you say about corny or whatnot, no, it's not corny. Do you know about the philosophy of Stoicism?
Yeah, relatively so.
You have only control of what you say, but you not have a control of how I perceive or anybody who listens to this. So relax.
Yeah.
It's not corny, I promise you. How would you like to be remembered?
Well, I feel like I have found science or the scientific understanding or approach. I think that's something that's very valuable. I just started listening to this book by Carl Sagan, The Demon Haunted World, Science as a Candle in the Dark. I really appreciate science, and I really think there's so much value to be had in it. If I can just contribute a little bit to science and communicate that to everybody, learning about different cultures and their values, I think it really helps put our own values and cultures into perspective. How I would like to be remembered, just contributing to our understanding of the world and ourselves.
If you could have a dinner with somebody, anybody in the history of the world, character from a book even, who would it be?
That's a good question. I think I have actually spent some time thinking about this, but well, I guess it would be extremely fascinating to have a conversation with maybe a Gravettian mammoth hunter, Solutrean flint napper, or anyone from the Paleolithic, really. Historical figures, I think it would be interesting to talk to Alexander the Great. I can't help but be a fan of his, even though, may have caused some wars and conflict. I can only imagine how interesting of a character he must have been in person.
I'm really tired now. It's 12 o'clock here. Okay, NORTH02. It was a pleasure talking to you.
It's a pleasure talking to you as well.
And I hope we will repeat this.
Yeah, I'm very excited.
Okay, have fun and good night.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.
This concludes this episode. I want to thank you for joining and listening. I hope we inspired you. I hope you learned something.